Well, gang, we finally did it. After 3.5 years, we have traveled through the entire book of Ezekiel. In this episode, this is going to kind of put a final button on things. What I'd like to do is reflect on the whole journey and give you an idea of when or if you're going to hear any more episodes of this podcast. And I'll also share some of the things that I learned about Bible study and podcasting in general, so that hopefully I could encourage some of you or even equip some of you if you'd like to go out and embark on a similar journey to what I've been doing right here. Some of this today, it's going to be a behind the scenes look at this podcast. But most of all, what I want to share is kind of just a personal story of how this study through the book of Ezekiel has impacted me. And so that's what you're going to hear if you listen all the way to the end today, one last time on the Cross References podcast. Welcome to the Cross References podcast. I should say the book of Ezekiel, a Cross References Bible study. And this is where we learn how every small piece of the Bible tells one big story and how they all connect to the cross and Christ. You'd think by the time I got to the last episode that I'd be able to say the name of the podcast correctly. But, well, my name is Luke Taylor, and I am Ezekiel. And if you listen to the end today, I'll explain why I say that. But today is part 84 of my series on the book of Ezekiel. And when I started this study, I honestly did not think that I was going to be spending 84 episodes covering this book. And that's what I really want to talk about first. I want to talk about why I started this podcast. And so this goes back to the year of COVID, which I guess that was 2020. And during COVID, so I was a youth pastor at that time. And we were, of course, under lockdowns. We couldn't, all meet together in church like we were used to doing. And I started recording, trying to think of different ways to do ministry during that time, stay connected with your flock, with your students, with your, the people you're shepherding. And so I started recording just like video sermons, tried to do short sermons and post them on our group Facebook page. And that's how I would try to stay connected with the youth group during that time. And then during that period, I also started experimenting with other types of digital online ministry. And so I started recording something called Eternal Perspectives. That's actually still on my YouTube channel. If you go back, I did, for a whole year, I did 52 weeks of Eternal Perspectives, which were short, like 3 to 5 minute videos that were just like a short little mini Bible study on a verse of scripture or something like that. And so I did that. The audio on those was terrible. I recorded them with my Nikon camera. And we just went down into one of the rooms of the basement of the church. And I just went down there with our teenage son at the time. We recorded those down there. The audio was terrible, but through that whole process, that's what really got me thinking in kind of a digital way about how you can do ministry online. How could I impact the world for God's kingdom through online Bible teaching? And so about a year after COVID, like summer of 2021, a year after the lockdowns, I started thinking about doing a podcast. And originally I was going to do video. That ended up being it was more of a bear than I thought it was going to be. And so I like even this video outro, which I only got to start using this year as I started incorporating the YouTube lives. But I hired some guy in Pakistan to make a really flashy looking video intro with my logo and all that for Cross References. And I didn't even get to use it till this year. But anyway, I did the first episode in video, did it 2 or 3 times, and it was going to be way too much work. So I ended up being an audio-only podcast, and originally the title was going to be 30-Minute Theology. And I'm glad I didn't go with that at this point, because these episodes are not usually under 30 minutes. So anyway, my plan when I started was to alternate topics that one week I would do a study through a book of the Bible, and then the next week I would do a random topic. And so that was going to be the format. And that is basically what I did for the first couple years. And we started into the book of Ezekiel. And so just every other week was an Ezekiel Bible study. And then the other weeks I would just do whatever I felt like talking about, if it was current events or if it was just some other random Bible study topic. And so I did that. So we launched in October of 2021 under that format. And I chose the name Cross References because I just love the idea of like connecting all kinds of different things in Scripture. That's something I feel like I've always been kind of good at intertwining a lot of things from different parts of the Bible and bringing them all together. And I just love that idea. You know, that's why you have a Bible that is called a Cross References Bible, right? Because that's what it's for. You connect all these other things that are related in Scripture. And I love that idea of that you can take things and connect them to the cross. You know, take even just some random thing we'd find in Ezekiel, but it would connect to what Jesus did. Happy Resurrection Sunday, by the way, if you're watching this live. That's the day I'm recording this final episode. So anyway, we if we could connect it to the cross, and I thought that was kind of the meaning of Cross References being the title of the podcast. So anyway, I did that for about 2 years. Didn't have a whole lot of success. Just the audience just kind of was stable, never really grew. And during that time, I left my job at the church and we moved in the middle of 2022. But even through all that, I'm going to talk more about that later, but I kept the podcast going. And I think I just took a few weeks off here and there, like the weeks that we were moving. And so if you listen to any episodes in that stretch of time from like the middle of 2022, there's probably to the end of 2022, there's a wide variety in audio quality all through there. I remember one time we were staying at my dad's farm for a weekend, and I just recorded, and I was basically semi-homeless during this time. I'll explain about that later. But I just remember recording an episode out at my dad's farm. I went out on his back deck with my microphone right here and my laptop, and recorded one on the back deck right there next to. You might have heard a moo in there during that period. So 2022 was pretty topsy-turvy for me. In 2023, I wanted to get more experimental. And I wanted to figure out what kind of stuff I could do with this podcast. So I did a series on transgenderism and just kind of trying to expose the Pride movement. I did it during Pride Month of that year and try to give a biblical perspective on the origins of that movement and what it's doing today. And so that was one series I did. And I did a series that summer on spiritual gifts. And then I did a series late summer, early fall. I did a series about how close the rapture could be. And those series were very successful. They were great at getting viewers or listeners. But since the whole podcast wasn't about those things, I couldn't really retain those listeners. I had trouble retaining them over time. And so what I really came to find out is that in podcasting, niching down is key. Okay, niching down is key. So I'll give you a few things I learned from podcasting through this whole process. Niching down means to narrow your focus. All right, so I was a Bible study podcast, but listen, there's a million, billion other Bible study podcasts out there. So it's like, how do you get yours to stand out? How do you get yours to be different from what everyone else is doing? So I thought I had kind of a unique idea, this study through a book of the Bible and alternate with other things. But honestly, I wasn't focused on just one thing. I needed to focus my attention on just one subject. You could do a whole podcast on spiritual gifts. When I say a whole podcast, I mean long series of episodes. And you could probably be very successful at it. You could do a whole podcast on transgenderism and bringing a biblical perspective to it. You could do a whole podcast about the rapture, and you will probably get a lot of people to tune in. But when you try to do a podcast that's just about all those things or whatever Luke feels like talking about, is not going to go very far. You might get a few spikes, in downloads here and there because you do a particular episode that catches a lot of people's attention, but you're not going to keep that audience over time. And so if you want to be successful in podcasting, you need to niche down, which makes actually so much sense. Everyone thinks, well, if I want a wide audience, then I need to make my podcast for everybody. I want it to be something everybody would want to turn into. Well, that's just the shortcut to failure right there. If that's what you try to do, don't try to appeal to everybody. You have to be bold enough, brave enough to say, most people out there, I am not trying to get their attention. I am not trying to get, most people, I am not trying to get them to listen to my podcast. There's a specific type of person who I want to have listen to my podcast, and that's who I'm going for. And if you do that, you're going to be a lot more successful. So niche down, that would be my first piece of advice, this is so obvious now in hindsight because I used to tell authors this, that whenever I used to interview a lot of authors on the radio. I was in my first job in radio, and it's my job again. I'll talk more about that later. But one of my traditional duties each week, or my weekly duties, was that I would interview an author literally every day of the week, Monday through Friday. We had an author interview show. So I got to talk to all these different Christian authors, and off the air, they would ask me questions like, hey, what advice would you give me? I'm trying to promote my book. Is there anything I should be saying? What should I be doing different? And I was constantly telling them, if you try to make your book sound like it's for everybody, then no one's going to care to pick it up. But if you say, hey, this is a book for pastors who are struggling to grow their church. This is a book for moms whose children just moved out of the house. If you make your book about a specific audience that you're trying to reach, and don't say, oh, I think any Christian would love this book. No, like you say, pick a specific type of Christian who has a specific need in their life, a specific pain point, and talk about how your book addresses that pain point. You're going to do a lot better in the sales, because now everybody who's experiencing that pain point or knows someone who is, they're going to be much more likely to go pick up that book. It's a very similar idea with podcasting. You got to be brave enough to say, I'm not going to try to make this appeal to everybody. I'm going to make it appeal to a specific type of audience that I'm trying to reach. And I'm just telling you, you'll be a lot more successful when you go that route. So the way that I transitioned this podcast after a couple years is I said, okay, it's not that my Ezekiel episodes were necessarily getting the most downloads, but I realized I would do better at building an audience if I made this a podcast specifically just about the book of Ezekiel. And so that's what I started doing at the end of 2022. And about 6 months later, I even changed the name of the podcast. It wasn't just called Cross References anymore, but I called it The Book of Ezekiel, a Cross References Bible Study. Now, if I was starting from scratch, I probably wouldn't have picked that name. I would have put something about Ezekiel in the name, but I would have came up with something else. The thing is, I'd already started the Cross References, brand, if you might call it that. That's what I had started with. So I tried to keep that in there, but I tried to also say this is about the book of Ezekiel. And since then, the podcast has steadily grown. It hasn't exploded or anything, but it's steadily grown since then in a way that it did not do for the first 2 years of this podcast. So niching down was definitely a good decision. And that would be my main advice. If you want to start a podcast, especially a Bible study podcast, because I can speak to that the most, don't just call it a Bible study podcast. Really, this was a book of Ezekiel study with a strong emphasis on end times Bible prophecy. And so that's what I would probably market it as. If I was starting from scratch, I would do things a lot different, but that's what I would really be pushing. And during that time period of the end of 2022, 23, at the end of 23, I started a second podcast, which is called Weird Stuff in the Bible. And that one has been much, much more successful because I started that one more getting off on the right foot, niching down. So that's also a Bible study podcast, but it focuses specifically on the name really says it all, Weird Stuff in the Bible. And I do some other things. I always keep those episodes 30 minutes or less. And I have found that if I keep it focused on the supernatural realm, that is really the key to getting a lot of listeners. When I try to go off and I talk about something that's maybe a weird thing in Scripture, but it's not necessarily pertaining to the supernatural, I see a big drop in the downloads. And so that would be my next piece of advice is you just find what your audience is craving, what they're going for, and you keep hammering on that. So on Weird Stuff in the Bible, one time, I think it was last fall, and the podcast was about a year old at that point, and it just had steady growth all the way through. It never stabilized like this one did for 2 years. It's been a consistent growth pattern. But I did an episode about praying for evil leaders or wicked leaders. That's what the Bible tells us to do. Pray for your leaders, even if they're bad leaders. You pray for them. And I thought, well, that's kind of a weird command. Well, my audience sure didn't care much about it, so because it wasn't really pertaining to the supernatural. It was pertaining to prayer, but it was about we got to pray for our leaders, even if it's a leader that you don't like. You still got to pray for them. And that was an election season. Maybe people just didn't want to hear that. But that episode ended up being a total dud because I kind of got out of my lane. Okay, they were really digging when I would talk about the supernatural topics. So I tried to stick more to that since then. And so not every episode's going to be a home run, but you find what your audience is looking for, and you just stay on that and, give the people what they want, right? If you want it to grow, if you want to reach people, find out what kind of content are they looking for, and maybe what other people are not giving them, what they can't find anywhere else. And so that's key. Here's another piece of advice: your episode titles. That is so important in a way I did not realize before. So if you listen to podcasts, you already know this, but maybe you haven't thought about this from a production standpoint. But the number one thing that's going to make people decide whether they want to click on your episode is the title. And I always used to have a bad habit that I would kind of go for these like artsy titles that just, they literary type of titles, something like how C.S. Lewis might name one of his books. I would try to go for some unique, special title. But here's the problem: I'm not C.S. Lewis. Okay, my name is not selling any books. So if you're not someone who's already a big famous author, what you got to do is have a title. And I say author, I'm talking about podcasting here. But you got to have a title that's going to draw people in. Now, what I like about podcasting is that you're not fighting an algorithm when it comes to podcasting. You are on YouTube, but I mean, like when someone's scrolling their podcast app on their phone, it shows them the latest episodes, with the most recent episode being right at the top. And then it just goes down from there all the way down to the least recent episode of all the podcasts that you're subscribed to. So you're not fighting an algorithm whenever you put a podcast out. Your episode is going to show up right at the top on people's devices. The thing is, are they going to care to click on it and listen to what it's about? And so your title has to tell them that. And it has to give them a hook. Like, it has to hook them in from the title and say, this is what the episode is about, and this is why you should listen. And so that's key. All right. And if you can make it SEO friendly, that means where search engines are going to pick it up. So when people search for that content later, they're going to find those episodes. Then, I mean, that's really the key thing right there. So that is like the number one thing. When you're putting together a podcast episode, you start with the title. You center the episode around what the title is going to be and and you pick a title that's going to draw people in. And then the second most important thing for getting listeners is the first 2 minutes of your podcast. You have got to hook them in. You've got to give them a reason to listen, and to listen all the way to the end. Research actually shows that it's the first minute and 50 seconds. That's what it takes to hook somebody. So when someone pulls up your podcast, here's what we're doing as we pull up a podcast, guys. We're trying to decide if this podcast episode is going to be worth our time. And the research shows you got a minute and 50 seconds to do that on average. Okay? You got to give people a reason to keep listening, and you got to do it quick. All right? Now, I do not do this perfectly, but I have been doing it better in the last 2 years of the podcast than I was the first 2 years, because I figured, I learned this, that like, if you don't give people a reason to listen, if you don't do it in your first minute and 50 seconds, some kind of intrigue, some kind of reason to listen to this episode, you need to tell the listener what they're in for and what they might learn if they listen all the way to the end, or they might not care to keep listening after the first few minutes. Okay? So if you will do that, if you'll give them a reason, you're going to have much better podcast retention. And most podcasts don't do this. Most podcasts, they get on and they kind of make small talk for a few minutes. You know, if they got a co-host, they'll just talk about random things that happened this week. And when I'm listening to a podcast I haven't heard before, like, I don't got time for that. Okay, I clicked on this episode to learn a specific thing, and you all are not getting around to it, and I don't know how much of my time I'm going to have to waste to figure out if you ever are going to get to it and how good it's going to be when you get there. So if you want to retain listeners, don't hop on and do like what I learned to do in Preacher Boy School, where you have like a 3 to 5 minute intro in your sermon to build it, to introduce the topic to people. You can't do 3 to 5 minute intros on a podcast. Okay? You do like a 1 minute intro, and then you get into the content. Get into that content in the first couple of minutes. Podcast audiences are different from sermon audiences. A sermon audience is a church. It's a congregation, and they're kind of trapped. Okay? Like they can't get up, and they're probably not going to get up and walk out in the first 2 minutes of your sermon, right? So you got to, in a podcast, they will click away real quick. You got to get right into the meat as fast as possible. If you got a guest, Don't read some like 2-minute bio about your guest that most of the people listening have never heard of this guy or heard of this girl, and they're not going to care to sit through a bio. Don't do it. Just get right into it. Do the bio later. Hey, by the way, we've been talking today. You do like a 1-minute or 1-sentence bio, and then you get right into what you need to talk about. Okay? That's all you got to do. But podcast audiences, that you gotta hook them in. So that's my free advice. If you want to start podcasting as a Christian, make a Christian Bible study or whatever podcast you want to do, that's really key. That's some stuff that I've learned here in the course of this podcast. And so there you go. Some key episodes or key moments from this past, I've been calling it 4 years. It's really been 3.5. We started in October of 2021. Here we are in April of 2025. And so before I started this podcast, I probably would have told you that my favorite chapter of Ezekiel is chapter 18. And that is probably still the case. I would still probably say I love chapter 18. So chapter 18 is about personal responsibility, that we are responsible for ourselves. And we did 3 episodes covering chapter 18. Those are episodes 60, 62, and 65. And episode 62 in particular, that was really important to me because I gave my history of wrestling with the issue of once saved, always saved versus can you lose your salvation? And so I drilled down into that and kind of gave where I stand on that. That's episode 62 of the podcast. Now, it's going to be the Ezekiel series part something else, part 25 or something, okay? Because like I said, episode 62, half the episodes by that point had been about Ezekiel specifically, and half had been about another random topic. So when I say episode 62, it's like in your podcast app, it tells you the podcast numbers for all these episodes, and that's where you can go back and find chapter 18, where I talk about personal responsibility, salvation, and all the ways that I've kind of dealt with that over my life. Another key episode for me was the episode covering chapter 14. And that was the episode that at the time I put it out, I was the most scared to put that episode out of anything that I'd worked on. Okay, so chapter 14 of Ezekiel, that presents a radical new way of viewing God, a way that I had never been taught in church growing up. This is the chapter where it actually says, if a prophet, if he's purporting to speak in God's name and he does so falsely, that God will literally put a lie in that prophet's mouth and let him tell the people just whatever the people want to hear. Not necessarily what the truth is, but God will put a lie in that prophet's mouth and let him tell the prophet, let him tell the people just what the people want to hear, just what the prophet wants to say to, make money or whatever he's in it for. So that's when someone's a false prophet, like it says in there, he'll put a lie in their mouth. And I'm like, God, he says, I will deceive that prophet. I'll make the prophet think he's telling the truth. I'm like, that does not sound like God. In fact, as I studied that chapter, there's commentators who say, well, this was a mistake. This wasn't supposed to be in the Bible. And, this was added later. It didn't really come from Ezekiel. It didn't really come from God because this is just not how God would behave. But honestly, guys, God preserves his word, and that is what it says about him. And once you understand this about God, that he will deceive his enemies, you will see him doing this all throughout Scripture. If someone's an enemy of God, then God is in a warfare situation with that person or that entity, and God will treat them the way you treat your enemies in combat. He'll deceive them. And so, that's gonna shake the way that some people think about God. That was a paradigm-shifting chapter for me. But you will recognize that God does this all throughout the Scriptures once you understand what he's doing in Ezekiel 14. So that episode is called, it's episode 46, Idols of the Heart. And I got a call actually a couple weeks ago from a kind listener named Rick, and he even brought that episode up as that was a kind of, I don't know, illuminating for him too. So appreciate your call, Rick. That was a great conversation a few weeks ago. It was a busy day for me, but I was glad I got a chance to chat for a little bit there. So anyway, another vital episode to me, episode 12. This goes way back to almost the beginning of the podcast, but it was about mass formation psychosis and the Antichrist. And so again, that was real early in the podcast, but I always felt pretty pleased with that one and how that turned out. That was dealing with a very current event issue that was going on at that time. So And then another episode series that I liked, I did a couple episodes with a coworker of mine who also has a podcast. His name's Daniel Moore. And we did a couple episodes proving the pre-tribulation rapture, why it must be pre-tribulation. And so Daniel also hosts a podcast, which is currently titled Marriage, Life, and More. And he has a great series on marriage that he just did. If you're married, if you're planning to get married, highly encourage you to check out that series of Marriage, Life, and More, a series of episodes he just did with his wife that they were incredible content. But anyway, we teamed up and we did an episode about the pre-trib rapture. And so I felt like those were episodes 47 and 48. Great listens right there. One episode that I kind of regret is episode 73, and it's called The Bible is Literal. And that was an exploration of the end of Ezekiel 20. And I do believe the Bible is literal, but in retrospect, as I was kind of going back over some of that stuff, I don't think I picked a very good place in Ezekiel to make that point. That was a really poor chapter to try to make that point. So I thought if I ever reteach Ezekiel, I would probably wait. I would wait till chapter 36. Chapter 36 makes that point a lot better. I would have put probably just chapter 20, the end of chapter 20. I would have put it with my study on chapter 21. So if I have like one regret from my series on Ezekiel, that would probably be it. I would say just if you ever go back to other old episodes, skip over episode 73. That one's not a good representation of but biblical scholarship, okay? Which I'm not a scholar. I never said I was. But that would be poor scholarship right there, episode 73. Just a couple more I'd highlight. Ezekiel 21 is episode 84, and it's called Nothing is Random. I talked about the process of casting lots to determine God's will. And I recently turned that one into a sermon, and I shared that sermon here on the podcast too. So you might have heard it recently. But that's one that I really liked that chapter. I thought that really opened my mind to a lot of things about how God works. And then finally, my interviews with Nate Vinio, and those were a 3-parter. It was actually one long conversation, but I split it up into 3 episodes because it was so long. But that's episodes 120 through 122. I just shared them again recently also. That was a great memory for me in the history of this podcast. So those are the highlights there, a low light in the highlights. And now I just want to share a little bit about how this study has impacted me. And I want to start with how Ezekiel's story begins. Okay, so a lot of the biblical prophets, they will begin with some kind of date, some kind of dating system, and it's usually related to a king. And this lets you know where in the whole history of Israel, where you could orient this prophet's story. In the case of Ezekiel, he actually begins with 2 dates. And so it says in Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Chebar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. That is a lot of prepositional phrases right there. So I know that's one of those like long verses you can kind of get lost in the weeds. And well, let's get in the weeds here for just a minute. I'm gonna take a drink. So this episode is not brought to you by Power Armor. That's just the drink I happen to hold right there in front of the camera. Okay, so let's get into some of these weeds here for a minute. And we're going to start at the back and work our way forward. So Ezekiel is said to be in the land of the Chaldeans. Long story short, this is the land of Babylon. Ezekiel had been carried off captive. And so when the Babylonians, and this is around the year 600 BC, when they came after Israel and whenever they destroyed it, the attacks came in waves. There were actually 3 big waves that were several years apart. The first was kind of a small wave. And Nebuchadnezzar came in, and he kidnapped a small group of Jewish people, one of whom was the prophet Daniel. You can read his story in his book. And then he came in another wave about 9 or 10 years later, and he took 10,000 of the Jews in that attack. Took 10,000, I'm sure killed a bunch of them too, but 10,000 went into captivity, and this was Ezekiel. He was one of those 10,000, and he was carried off to the land of the Chaldeans. And then Ezekiel, throughout his book, the first half of the book, he's prophesying about that third wave that's coming, that third attack, when Jerusalem is finally going to be besieged and destroyed. And that is the big one where Ezekiel is essentially wiped out as a nation. So that takes up the first half of his book. But so you got to orient yourself in Ezekiel's story. He was taken captive in that second wave. Okay, he was carried off. And so now he's in the land of Babylon. And at this point in Ezekiel chapter 1, God is going to show up in this chapter. And in the first 3 chapters of the book, he commissions Ezekiel, gives him a mission to go and speak to his fellow captives who are there at it's a city called Tel Aviv. So anyway, it's right here by the Chebar Canal. So that is the location where Ezekiel is. He is an Israelite, but he is not in Israel. He's been ripped out of his land and transplanted in this foreign country that he is not allowed to leave. And so, meanwhile, there's a whole group of Israelites back home who are just fine and dandy, living in Jerusalem, living back at their homes. So he's been like taken away from his people. And the rest of his people are still dwelling there because that third attack has not come yet. So he's just kind of off by himself. All right. Also in these verses, we learned that Ezekiel was a priest. And the priests were the holy men of Israel. All right. It was their job to maintain the temple, to perform religious duties to God. They were kind of like the pastors of the Old Testament, right? And so Ezekiel is not able to do those things. He has been taken away captive, and he has no temple that he can minister in. All right, and then at the very start there, it gives 2 different dates. And like I said, this is typical in the books of the prophets, that it will give a date that's usually tied into a king, and that is what the second date is there in verse 2. It relates this to, 5th day of the month, 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. Okay, so that's just kind of the typical date, the way that a lot of prophets begin. But the first one, verse 1, it's a little bit more mysterious. It just says, in the 30th year. So we might say, in the 30th year of what? Well, the answer is, it's the 30th year of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is 30 years old this year. Now, why is that significant? Well, whenever you turn 30 as a Levite, that is whenever you begin your temple service. Until then, a priest was just in training. He was learning how to be a priest. He was learning what he's supposed to do whenever he takes over as a priest someday, but you actually don't begin your priesthood until the age of 30. And if I remember correctly, you only serve until you're 50. So you have like a 20-year window where you serve, but until age 30, you're just a priest in training. And Ezekiel is now 30. So let's think about what he must be feeling right now psychologically, okay? He's carried captive. He's held against his will in a foreign country. He's been training his whole life to be a priest, and here he is stuck in a foreign land, no temple to minister in, and the thing that he trained for his whole life to do, he's not able to do it. What kind of thoughts do you think are going through Ezekiel's head? If I were Ezekiel, here's what I'd be thinking. God, what's wrong? Like, didn't I serve you well? Wasn't I doing a good job in my preparation? God, why am I here? Why did all this bad stuff have to happen to me? Like, out of all the Israelites who were taken, why was I one of the ones who was taken? I mean, God, I know I'm not perfect, but I was trying. I mean, I was trying a lot harder than some of those other bozos in the temple. I was really trying to do good to be a good priest for you. And now, God, here I get on my Instagram and I see the priests back home and I see what they're doing in the temple, and their lives are moving forward. Their lives are accomplishing all the things that they trained to do. And here I am, and I've been taken away captive into this foreign land, and I got nothing to do, got no way to use the skills that I've been training my whole life for. I'm stuck. Okay, I'm just stuck here, and I feel like my life has no purpose. God, I feel like you've totally forgotten about me. God, what did I do wrong? Why'd you reject me? Why am I one of the ones who was taken? Okay, I would imagine if I just put myself in Ezekiel's shoes, those are probably the emotions that he's experiencing right now. He probably feels rejected by God. He's probably asking, why me? And don't we all kind of get like that sometimes? I mean, we get on, I kind of joked about Instagram a minute ago, but we get on Facebook, right? And everyone else's lives, they look fine, they look perfect, and we might be going through a hard time, and we wonder why is this happening to me? Everyone else's life looks so perfect. Why am I the one who has all these problems that other people don't have to struggle with? They're maybe not even living godly. They're not even, trying to follow God like I am. Why is my life so much harder? It's just not fair. And to be honest, if I could just be honest with you all, I kind of went through a similar journey over the past few years over the course of this podcast. So I'll tell you a little bit behind the scenes what was going on in my life. From 2021 to 2022, I started to feel like the Lord was leading me away from my current place of ministry in youth. And I loved my teens. I loved my job. I loved what I was doing. But, I also love God. And if I feel like God's telling me I need to do something different, then I need to be obedient to that. I thought God's not going to bless me if I stay here longer than the time he's allotted for me to be here. And I don't know how to explain it, but you just kind of feel, there were maybe times where I had a bad week or a bad month and I wanted out. Like I wanted to do something different. I said, God, I don't even care to be a youth minister anymore. I'm ready for a change. But I would not feel that release. Like God was like, no, you got to stay. Like I just felt this burden to stay and not to quit. And so I powered through those times. And in general, I really did love what I was doing. I always worried, like, am I being effective enough? You have those concerns. But I did enjoy it. I enjoyed that position. And so I felt this release that God was saying, you're released. It's time to go doing something else. And I'm kind of sad about that, but I'm also excited because I'm like, what's the next thing going to be? I didn't know what the next thing was going to be, but I felt that I needed to be obedient to the Lord and leave what I was doing. And so here's one of the things about the church world. When I say church world, I mean like people who work in churches. So I was a youth pastor. I was not the senior pastor. And one of the expectations is that if you decide that you want to start looking for another job, you're supposed to tell the senior pastor before you start looking. Okay, like before you put in an application or any of that kind of stuff, like you're supposed to tell the senior pastor and give him a heads up. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I just don't think it's fair to the employee, but that was the expectation. So, and plus, if I'm sending out applications or applying at other churches or something like that, they could very well call my current pastor and ask him, what kind of employee I am. And I didn't want to catch him off guard with that. So I went ahead and I felt that release in February of 2022. And so I went and talked to him in March of 2022. I remember it was the week of spring break. And this was kind of taking a big risk, okay? Because I was supporting my family. My livelihood was dependent on this job. I was a full-time youth pastor. And not only that, I was given a house to live in. We had a parsonage for the church. And so this is part of my compensation. It's part of my job is that we get to live in this house. So when I quit at my job, I'm also giving up my house. And I did not have a second house. Okay. We had a pretty healthy savings, but I didn't want to go buy a house I didn't even want to go put a lease on an apartment or something because I didn't know where God was leading me next. So I'm like, I don't want to sign a lease on this city and then God moves me 2 hours over that way and I got to break the lease or whatever. I wanted to figure out where we were going to be working before I figured out where exactly we needed to be living next. So once I told my senior pastor that, I felt like the Lord was leading me to move to do something else, then I was going to have to figure out a new work situation and a new living situation shortly after that. Now, again, I'm like, God's telling me to do this. So God, I trust you to put the pieces together and put everything into place. But this went on for about 4 months. Like I was constantly looking for a church where if I could be a pastor, associate pastor, teaching pastor. I didn't really feel like I was being led to go into youth ministry or children's ministry. I felt like I was feeling like I was starting to get more fruitful in my ministry to adults. So I felt like, but honestly, I didn't have the slightest inkling where God wanted me to go. And again, I was kind of in faith. Like, I'm like, okay, one of these days, God's going to open the door. He's going to show me like what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what he's going to have me doing next, but if I just keep praying, if I just keep waiting, like one of these days, God's going to part the heavens and shine a light and say, this is where you're supposed to go. And I'll go, and he's going to turn the situation around. Guys, listen, I have heard so many stories of people saying, well, God told me to quit my job and I didn't know why, but I went in and I quit. And by the end of the day, I had a new job somewhere else. By the end of the week, I had a new job in this city and it was better and all this stuff. And so like, this is what's in my head. Like I've heard all these stories my whole life. You've probably heard them too, where people are talking about how God told them to do this thing and it seemed radical and crazy, but they obeyed it. They stepped out in faith. And it's like by the end of the week, they had another job lined up. Well, guess what? I get to the end of summer and I don't have any prospects so toward the end of summer. So finally a church offered to let me try out. I sent an application. So this one, and maybe you could say I'm starting to get more desperate. Like early on, I was looking for churches nearby. And as these months went on and I wasn't finding anything, I kept expanding the reach. So finally, one of them, which was another state away, several hours away from my family and all that, in a town I'd never even visited before. But it looked like a pretty good church, and I think it was. It's the first serious prospect I had. Got through the interview and all that. They needed a new senior pastor. So I'm going to go try out at this church. And so when I told my current senior pastor that I was going to go try out at this church, he says, okay, but now you have to move out in the next few weeks. And he like pointed at a date on the calendar and basically gave me 2 weeks and said, you got to be out by then, like out of my house. And so I'm thinking in my head, okay, well, like this church must be the one then, because if I don't get this job, we're basically homeless in a few weeks. And so, but I still had a lot of faith. I wasn't crazy about moving that far away from my family. But I just thought, God, it feels like all the other bridges are burned right now. Like this is the only one forward. So I'm going to go for it here. And anyway, and let me say this about, do I think it's great that I kind of got forced out of my house like that? No. But on the other hand, he did give me 4 months to look for another job. Technically, he could have had me go out of there months earlier than that. So I just decided I'm just going to be thankful for the 4 months I got. And God's in control. And so it all comes down to, I'm going to go down to this church and I'm going to try out. I felt pretty good about it because, I'm Assemblies of God pastor. In the assemblies, once you get through like the screening, the interview process, they check you out so much. Once you get through all that, and I went down to interview in person with the deacon board, they're like the search committee. And by the time you get that far into it, like by the time you get invited down to go speak at a church and actually try out for the church, you tend to get voted in. I'm sure it's happened, but I don't even know of a situation where someone got to that point. It's probably happened lots of times, but I've never even heard of a story where someone tried out for a church and did not get voted in. They got voted out. Never heard of that. So I'm feeling pretty good about my chances. I get down there and I find out I am not the only candidate that they are bringing in to try out for the congregation. I find out that I am one of 5 who's trying out for this church. And long story short, I was not the one picked. And so it's like, what is happening, God? Like I kind of bet my future here on this church, stepped out in faith in a big way. And guess what? I came back from trying out at that church, never heard from him again. And in 2 weeks, I had 2 weeks to pack up all the stuff in our house, put it in a storage locker, and then we went and moved in with my wife's parents. And so, and my wife's parents are wonderful people, okay? They're godly people. They are some of the kindest people that you'd ever meet, okay? Some of the most good-hearted people you'd ever meet. But just as a father, as a husband, like I felt like such a failure. I felt like I had just let my family down so much, I couldn't even take care of them. I lost our house. We didn't have a job now. My wife wasn't working. She had been able to be a stay-at-home mom ever since we'd had our son, who's now 6, but at this time he's like 2 or 3. So I just felt like such a failure. And I'm like, God, why is this happening? So our other son, we had a teenage son that we adopted from foster care. But at this time and during this year, he was actually in the National Guard. and he was overseas. So he wasn't even, this thankfully was not affecting him as much directly like it was for us. But then I had to go through a new phase of job hunting, living at my in-laws. And at this point, I'm not even just, I'm so down, like psychologically, I felt like such a failure. I didn't even try at any other churches. I started applying all over the place. I was applying at jobs I wasn't even qualified for. If you've ever been in that position before, maybe you understand. And finally, eventually, the Christian radio station that was my first job when I was 17, they offered me to take me back full time. And so we ended up buying and moving into a house nearby the radio station. That's where I have been ever since. But it was not the way I thought. I lived with my in-laws probably another 4 months. So for about 8 or 9 months of 2022, I was in a period of much struggle. Okay, and my question the whole time was, God, why is all this happening? Like, God, I've heard story after story after story, people stepping out in faith, doing things like what I did, and they always got these happy endings, like God parted the seas and showed them the way, and that did not happen for me. And you hear so many pastors, they say stuff like, hey, if you just step out in faith, just watch what God will do if you step out in faith. And it never happened that way for me. And I kept asking myself, even for years after this incident, I kept asking myself, like, God, where did I go wrong? I really thought I was following your plan. And this is what you always go back to. Did I hear from God correctly? Maybe if you're listening, you're wondering, like, yeah, are you sure you heard from God? But honestly, if I didn't hear from God at that time, I don't even know the first thing about hearing from God. Like, it was just the clearest thing. And I even look back, and all these things were just converging in my life that were showing me, yeah, this is the right time to leave. I could go through them all, but I'm just telling you, if I ever heard from God, it was hearing from God on that. Like, it just seemed so clear. And yet it felt like I just lost everything in that process. Like, before I had a job that I really loved, really enjoyed, was really passionate about. Some people don't like it when you call a ministry a job. Here's what I mean when I say that. It was my income. Like, it was literally what I was doing to earn money, but it wasn't just like, I didn't think of it as just something to earn money. I wasn't like getting rich or anything. It was just something I was really passionate about. You want your career to be something that you're passionate about. And I had spent nearly a decade, my whole time in the church world, I had spent that time learning how to manage churches. Like, I mean, my wife could tell you basically about every night for those 10 years, every night I'm listening to sermons, listening to Bible studies, reading books on leadership and church management and money management. Like, I really tried to throw myself into the church world. I knew every pastor's name in my area, like trying to just network with them and learn more about how to be successful in this field. And I felt like all that knowledge and all that training had just basically gotten me nowhere. It felt like God had just taken me out of ministry with nothing to show for it. It just felt like God didn't want me in church ministry anymore. And so throughout this whole process, like, as I'm looking and on the inside, I'm just a wreck. And through this whole process, people keep coming to me and they're saying things like, Luke, you're so talented, Luke, you can do, because I know I can do all this stuff with media and production and all that. They're like, Luke, you can do anything. You have your whole life ahead of you. You have so many options. But I just felt like I only had one option. What did God want me to do? And try as I might, I prayed and all this stuff to figure out God's will. And I could not figure out what he wanted me to do. That was the only option I was going for. And so, yes, I did get another job eventually, and it's been taking care of my family. God blessed us. It's a whole miracle story of how he blessed us with a beautiful home that we were able to find at just the right time. But I still felt, even after we got through that really tough season of 2022, I just still felt this sense of like that I had failed, that I had been rejected by God. Like this one thing that I had trained for so many years. And I legitimately enjoyed it. And yet I felt like I just lost it. And I didn't know if it was ever coming back. Or I didn't know if God was just washing his hands of me. And so that's why I say, I am Ezekiel. Because I imagine that Ezekiel had some really similar feelings. that he's been sitting over there. He's been overlooking the canal. He's 30 years old. He's trained for this one particular thing his whole life. And here he is as a 30-year-old, the year that he should be beginning his priesthood, and he's stuck somewhere else. He can't do it. You'd feel like you were rejected by God. And then, if you keep reading in that story, God shows up. He gives Ezekiel a calling to be a prophet. And if you remember, at first, Ezekiel is really resistant. There's a verse here in Ezekiel 3, verses 14 and 15. It said, "The Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit." He was mad about this calling. He was angry with God. He said, "And I came to the exiles at Tel Aviv who were dwelling by the Chebar Canal, and I sat where they were dwelling, and I sat there overwhelmed among them for 7 days." And eventually God comes back and asks him again, "Hey, will you be a prophet for me, Ezekiel?" But Ezekiel had to sit and stew about it for 7 days first, in the bitterness of the heat of my spirit. He had some frustration. Now, during my ordeal, I wouldn't say I was ever really mad at God. I was just more confused. Like, I know that God is good. And I know I didn't have it as bad as Ezekiel, okay? So I'm not even judging Ezekiel here. He was carted away to another country against his will. Like, he had a much bigger thing to go through than I did. But I just felt like kind of just this, not anger with God, but just a sense of, or a feeling. I'm not saying it was a sense from God, but a feeling of rejection from God. Confused. It felt like I just lost my job, even though I technically quit it, but it felt like I lost it, and he didn't tell me why. And so that brings me to maybe my testimony from this year. And there's been other stuff I've gone through the past couple years. It really has been a topsy-turvy few years for my family. I didn't even go into, in the past 5 years, my parents have divorced, and they've remarried other people, and they married good people, okay? So, but I'm just saying, like, I went through a lot of change in my family very, very quickly. And my wife went through kind of a serious physical health issue for at least a year there during that whole time too. She didn't almost die or anything, but like she was seriously restricted in her life. And just, when you're in the midst of something like that, you don't know if it's ever going to end. Like, you don't know if you're ever going to get out of it. So it was a really just discouraging time period for us, a very tough time for a few years. And so this is why I say, like Ezekiel, I'm just asking myself, why me? Like, I know my life's not the hardest one out there, but why did all this have to happen? And there were times I came really close, guys. I came really, really close to just resigning my credentials and just walking away from anything ministry related ever again, because I felt like, God, you just must not want me in this. So I thought, I just need to resign my credentials and walk away. And I came really close a few times. And so these feelings kind of just lingered probably for a year and a half, maybe close to 2 years. But I just want to tell you, at the start of this past year, God really began to unlock some things for me. Okay, so one thing during this whole process of the past few years, I started keeping a prayer journal. All right, and one thing that my pastor at the church where I'm going now, he encouraged me to start off this year with a fast. And so I did, and one night, so I went down to my basement to get alone with God, and I bring my prayer journal because I think I might write out some prayers while I'm down there. And what happens throughout the night is I start reviewing what I've been journaling about over the past few years. And as I was reviewing that, I was shocked. Like, I looked at the person that I was 2 or 3 years ago, and I didn't even recognize him. I looked at the Luke of 2 or 3 years ago, and I was like, who is this guy? Like, there's things about me that are so different from how I am today. I was just like, okay, he's kind of entitled and whiny, and he was so earthly minded compared, and I'm not saying I'm some, perfect human perfection now, not at all. But I just looked at who I was a few years ago, and I'm like, oh man, like, I have grown a lot since then. Okay, 2 or 3 years ago, I was struggling with like fleshly and earthly things that I don't even have a desire for today, that I don't even think about today. They don't even have a pull on me anymore. And so here's what I realized. I said, God, if you had to take me out of the church world for a few years and do some heart surgery on me and fix up some things in my life, then I just say, God, I think you knew what you were doing. if this is what it took, it was worth it. I trust that you know best. And honestly, I would not trade the spiritual growth that I've experienced the last 3 years. I would not trade that for a better job. I would probably not trade it for anything. Like, this 3-year process has brought me so much closer to God. And I don't even feel like I'm done with it yet. When I say, oh, I've arrived now, no, you know what? God, I know you're doing something you're working on me. I'm just going to sit back and let you do your work. Okay? Because I felt before, like, God, you must be done with me. Okay? Like, you must, and that's probably how Ezekiel felt as well. But as we keep reading in Ezekiel, God did have a plan for Ezekiel. It's just not what God had trained. It's not what Ezekiel thought it was going to be. Okay? Ezekiel had spent all that time training for the priesthood. It is a position of spiritual leadership. God had a different kind of spiritual leadership in mind for what Ezekiel was to do. And so, Ezekiel does not end with 3 chapters and he's just stewing on the side of a hill. Ezekiel gets 45 chapters of glorious prophecies that come along after that. So that's what the rest of his book is about. And so as I think about, the journey God's taken me on, he might have another ministry for me as well. Maybe it's in church. Maybe it's in something else. I don't know what it is yet. But I am so much more content than I ever was before, because now I realize he wasn't putting me out here because he was rejecting me or saying I just wasn't, I'm not good enough to be a pastor or good enough to be in ministry anymore. He wasn't sidelining me. He was working on me. He was preparing me. I'm not even sure what for, but I recognize it now that God was doing a work in my life. I have a more mature faith now than I did before. And so maybe this didn't go like the fairy tale story that I thought it was going to when I walked into my senior pastor's office and told him I felt God was telling me to move on. Yeah, it didn't go the way I thought it would after that. But I just tell you what, I know that God is doing something, and I'm able to be content now with the process. And I've mentioned this probably before. A few months ago, a church actually did contact me and ask if I could fill in as their interim pastor. And that's what I've been doing the past few months. And I just tell you what, guys, it's been just about the best 2 months of my life. Like, I've been having an absolute blast. I really feel like I've been helping people there. It's been an immense blessing in my life. And they are working towards getting a new senior pastor official. And so they'll probably have one in the next 6 weeks or so. That's going to take over the church. But honestly, I'm like, hey, you guys take your time, because this has been a really good experience for me. And so, yeah, life's going to go back to normal for me in a few months, but it really has made me feel like God had a purpose for a lot of this pain that I went through, and that God wasn't sidelining me. He's not done with me. My years of all that church training, they didn't all go to waste. He's just working on me right now. And at the right time, he's going to bring the desires that are within me. He's going to bring them to fruition in some type of career or calling, whatever it is that he leads me to, whether it's through my current position at the radio or whether God leads me in another direction someday. But I'm just saying, I'm trusting the process, because I know God is controlling the process. So he's got a purpose. He's got a purpose for me. And there's some verses I just wanted to share real quick that I think, this is not just my story, what you're going through in your life. If you're in a process, I firmly believe God's got a purpose for it. Philippians 1:6 says to all of us, "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." And then another verse here, James 2:1-4. He says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect," which is where I am right now. I need to let steadfastness have its full effect. Be patient in the process, okay? That you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So, right now I might not be enjoying my current job like I enjoyed my last job. I'll just say that. But I know that I'm where I'm supposed to be. I know that God's got me where he's got me for a purpose, for a reason. And so if we call this a wandering in the wilderness type of season right now, I'm okay with it, because I know that God is working on me through it. And I just need to make sure that I learn everything that I'm supposed to be learning as I go through this wilderness. And so I just share all this to say, God has a plan. If you are in a tough spot in life, if you're wondering, has God forgotten about me? I just want you to know, I don't believe God has sidelined you. I encourage you not to give up on seeking the Lord. A waiting season is not a wasted season. It can be a wasted season, but you don't have to waste it. Okay? Focus on developing yourself as you're walking through this wilderness. God needs to work in you before he can work through you. And if you try to shortcut the suffering, you're not going to be as effective or as fruitful as you could have been if you would just wait and do it in his time. So there you go. That's my testimony on what the book of Ezekiel has done for me in a personal way. For the future of this podcast, all right, as we're winding down here in just a minute, stay subscribed, all right? And if you're on YouTube, if you're watching this on YouTube or if you're a subscriber on YouTube, I'm still going to keep doing my other podcast called Weird Stuff in the Bible. That one's not ending. So that one, don't worry about that. That's going to keep going. But as far as these Bible studies, okay, we're done with Ezekiel. I've been thinking I would really like to do a similar study on the minor prophets. That's kind of like Ezekiel. I'm just going to focus on the Bible studies, not going to do random topics, but kind of like I've been doing with Ezekiel lately, I might step away to talk about something pertaining, like in Ezekiel, we've been talking about all kinds of things to do with the millennial kingdom of Christ because we were in that section of Ezekiel. So I might do things like that, but I want to keep it all pertaining to whatever we're studying as we go through various minor prophets. And I plan to start doing that this fall. All right. So I might drop a few things in over throughout the summer just to kind of keep this channel active, this podcast feed. So you don't need to unsubscribe. All right. But by August, you should know if there's going to be any more stuff coming on this podcast. I will have to change the name of the podcast again. All right. And I want it to be a name. I don't think I want to use the name Cross References anymore. So really the name Cross References is done after today. But what I'm thinking is that I might call it God and His Prophets. All right? Because that's a title that works with past content and it will work with new content. And it's that niche idea. It's that niching down of saying this is a podcast. It's a Bible study podcast, but it's about one specific thing. And it's just going to be a study of prophetic books of the Bible. So we've done Ezekiel, and now we'll go into the minor prophets, and maybe we'll go into Revelation or Jeremiah or Isaiah. So, but it's just going to be focused on these prophetic books. And so if we keep the podcast going, I think that's the direction we'll go. I just recommend don't unsubscribe just yet. Stay subscribed, and I'd say by August, there should be an episode put up that's going to tell you exactly where we're going next. It'll be a complete revamp. New name for the podcast, new cover, new theme song, new format. I'll probably try to keep them. I like a shorter show, so I'll try to keep them more on the short side. I think that's been successful for Weird Stuff in the Bible. I've been yakking for an hour straight now on here. I don't know if that's a great formula for success to go for that long. But anyway, if you're still listening, hey, bless you. Thank you for still being here. And I'm going to close down with just a few thank yous. Okay, just a few people I want to thank. Thank you to, I thanked Rick earlier, who I had a great conversation with. Thank you to Joe in North Carolina. I can't remember the name of the city where you're from, Joe. It was kind of hard to pronounce, so I won't try here. But Joe has been a regular for a long time on the podcast, left lots of encouraging comments and emails. And so, hey, Joe, I'm sure she's still with us. I just want to thank you for sticking with me for so long. And thank you also to everybody who has sent in a question or left a comment. Those are just so appreciated that people would take the time to do that. Thank you to Daniel Moore and Nate Vineo. And I mentioned both those guys earlier, but they're just fellow podcasters in the Christian space. They've been great buddies to bounce ideas off of and to collaborate with on episodes. And they've let me guest on their podcast and they've guested on mine. So thanks to those guys for all their help. And thank you to my wife, Emily. Emily's been, doing 165 episodes of a podcast takes a lot of time, but she's been very supportive to me. She's never made me feel bad about going down to record or going down to study or something like that. So I appreciate all her help and keeping me regularly caffeinated as I pour over all this Bible study and scripture. So finally, I just want to thank you. Thank you for listening to this Cross References Bible study on the book of Ezekiel. This has been Luke Taylor reminding you that no matter what is going on in your life, God has a plan and you are a part of it. And he knows what he's doing.